I wanted to start it off by playing something for you all, and then we'll let Tim Getz take it over. So this is an actual recording of Martin Luther King talking about the song "We Shall Overcome" and what it meant to the civil rights movement, and to the people who were a part of it.
There's a little song within our breasts with words of hope and love. The melody blends as we join hands with faith in God above. Dr. Martin Luther King now tells us of this song.
There's a little song that we sing in our movement down in the South. I don't know if you've heard it, but it has become the theme song. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome. Though I've joined hands so often with students and others behind jail bars singing it, we shall overcome. Sometimes we've had tears in our eyes when we joined together to sing it, but we still decided to sing it. We shall overcome. No, before this victory is won, some will have to get thrown in jail some more, but we shall overcome. Don't worry about us. Before the victory is won, some of us will lose jobs, but we shall overcome. Before the victory is won, even some will have to face physical death. But if physical death is the price that some must pay to free their children from a permanent psychological death, then nothing shall be more redemptive. We shall overcome. Before the victory is won, some will be misunderstood and called bad names and dismissed as rabble-rousers and agitators, but we shall overcome. And I'll tell you why. We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. We shall overcome because Carlyle is right. No lie can live forever. We shall overcome because William Cullen Bryant is right. Truth crushed to earth will rise again. We shall overcome because James Russell Lowell is right. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future. And behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. We shall overcome because the Bible is right. You shall reap what you sow. We shall overcome. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome. And with this faith, we will go out and adjourn the councils of despair and bring new light into the dark chambers of pessimism. And we will be able to rise from the fatigue of despair to the buoyancy of hope. And this will be a great America. We will be the participants in making it so. And so as I leave you this evening, I say, walk together, children. Don't you get weary. There's a great camp meeting in the corner.
Yay! The Reformation and music. I'm going to break this down into 3 parts today. The first part will be just who is Martin Luther and what did he do? I have no idea how much background you all have on just what the Reformation is at all, so we'll do a little bit of that. Then what effect did Luther's views and reforms have on the church and its music? And if we have time at the end, how does all of this influence my work as a musician in the church today? So we've already had a little Martin Luther King today. You'd be shocked how many people in the world don't know the difference between these two people. Martin Luther King's father was named Michael King, and actually Martin himself was named Michael King Jr. Martin Luther King's father, Michael, was a Baptist clergyman who actually did a lot of reading about the Reformation and about Martin Luther, who had lived back in the 16th century and was so inspired by his teachings and writings that Michael King actually changed his name to Martin Luther King, and he changed his son's name to Martin Luther King Jr. So, but the original Martin Luther lived back in the 16th century. Martin Luther was born in 1483 in Eisleben, which is a small iron mining village in Saxony. His father was an iron miner who had very high hopes that his son would become well educated, become a lawyer, and basically feed the family because iron mining was such a terrible job. I would say through all this, the dates don't really matter unless Scott tells you that they do, but the sequence of events kind of does matter.
The dates do not matter.
Excellent. Feel free to...
The only dates you need to remember is that Bach was born in 1685 and died in 1750, because those are the only composer dates that I remember. So it's not entirely true, but I think if you could use the dates like Tim was saying as a sort of landmarks for when these things were occurring and what was contemporaneous and what wasn't, that's the most useful thing for dates. Dates you can look up on Wikipedia anytime you need to.
Right. I think it's worth thinking about, especially once you're going to be getting into Bach, that this is all happening about 200 years before Bach. So Luther infuriated his father by getting his law degree and then deciding he wasn't going to be a lawyer. He was instead going to be a monk. And he enters an Augustinian monastery in Erfurt, a city not too far away, in 1505. And then a significant landmark is that in 1510, he is sent to Rome on some business for the monastery. Luther studied, once he gave up law, he studied the Bible and theology at the University of Wittenberg, which was a brand new university founded by the Elector of Saxony, Frederick the Wise. Luther does everything a monk should do and more. He says Mass every day, he makes daily confessions, he fasts, he performs acts of penance, even self-flagellation. Yet with all of this, he continues to feel inadequate at the feet of an angry God, that he just can't do enough to make God happy. Even his abbot tried to get him to chill out, but nothing worked. If this were all happening today, his abbot would probably send him to a therapist and get him a Prozac prescription. But basically, Luther just wasn't feeling good. And in 1510, he's sent on a trip to Rome. As I said, he walks there. When he sees Rome in the distance and falls on his knees at its beauty. He moves into the city. He sees its grandeur, its opulent, extravagant wealth. And then once he's been there for a pretty short time, he also witnesses the absolute corruption of the hierarchy and of the clergy. Sometimes, just if you want like a really salacious novel, just look up the lives of Pope Julius II or Pope Leo X, and just you can read about this scandalous, self-indulgent behavior that the popes and everyone around them were up to in the 16th century. This kind of stuff will just knock your socks off. So I think it's sort of these two things, this incredible fear of hell that Luther carried around with him, coupled with all the horrors that he's seeing in Rome, that kind of started to get him thinking. He knew the Bible really well, and in the Bible, he was perceiving a more gracious, loving, forgiving God in the New Testament than he was experiencing in the church. I want to think for a minute now about how all this opulence in Rome was funded. And this is my personal inner struggle sometimes, because I go nuts for Renaissance painting and sculpture and architecture. And we'll just look a little bit now. This is the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel that was being painted by Michelangelo at the very same time that Martin Luther went to Rome. This would have been the Pope's private chapel. It was not open to the public as it is now. So undoubtedly Luther did not see this, but this was being done simultaneously with his visit. This is in, if you've ever been to Rome, maybe you've seen some of this stuff. This is in the papal apartments, and the painting is called The School of Athens by Raphael, also painted at about the same time. again, in a private place where only the Pope and his friends would get to see it. This is in a church in Rome. This is a portion of the tomb of Julius II, which was commissioned while Julius II was Pope, was never actually completed until after Julius's death. And actually only about 1/3 of this tomb ever got built. I love that, like, this stuff just is hilarious to me. Like, up at the top of the tomb, you see the Pope kind of lounging there with his crown on. The Pope ultimately was buried in a place elsewhere, but you still see this fragment of his tomb in the Church of St. Peter in Chains in Rome. And kind of last but not least, this is the new St. Peter's Basilica, which was under construction at the time Luther visited Rome. The old St. Peter's, which had already stood there for 1,000 years, was torn down, and this largest and most opulent church in the world was being built at the time of Luther's visit. And here's just one of its interior, just to show how humongous it is, really. So the church where Scott and I attend, where I work and Scott attends in Palo Alto, took a group of 100 people to Germany in 2017 to visit historic sites related to Martin Luther in observance of the 500th anniversary of the beginning of the Reformation. And on the same trip, my spouse and I continued on to Italy, where we spent most of our time in Florence and in Rome. I had taken art history classes and seen all of this stuff in pictures, but seeing it in person was, for me, a serious religious experience. But back in the 16th century, most of the public never saw it. So sort of an open question is, how do we reconcile the glory of this wonderful art with the awfulness of its patrons and their graft on ordinary, faithful people to make it happen? It's still a question that I think we sometimes come across in different forms today. Awful people make beautiful things, and what do we make of that? So the construction of St. Peter's is really Exhibit A. St. Peter's was intensely expensive, as I said, the largest and most opulent church that was ever built. And the church was preying on people's fears of eternal punishment when it developed a scheme by which it would sell people indulgences in order to achieve partial forgiveness of their faults and to lop some years off the time they might be consigned to purgatory. So purgatory, if you don't know, is a place of temporary but still painful punishment that one might be sent to before you're allowed into heaven when you die. So you could buy these indulgences for yourselves or your friends or your family, and the whole system was set up in such a way that you couldn't just buy one and be done. You had to buy them again and again and again. The whole Catholic world is paying for indulgences, which is funding the opulence in Rome. Very little of this money stayed in Germany, where Luther lived, and it certainly was not being used to improve the lives of the sick and needy. It was all being funneled to Rome, and it was a fantastic moneymaker. So Luther responds. In 1517, this is 7 years after he actually visited Rome, so he had time to chew on this for a while. Luther posts the 95 Theses. Almost everyone has heard of these, but almost no one knows what they're really about. Scott tells me that in the past, this class has actually read the 95 Theses together, and I think I don't think I want to do that.
Yeah, that was one of the things that the quarantine cut from our experience here, y'all. So you can thank COVID for at least one thing.
Thanks, COVID. You don't have to read the 95 Theses. People often think these are Luther's 95 reasons for leaving the church. He posted them, and then there were Lutherans, and then they were done. Luther at this point still was not even thinking about leaving the church. The 95 Theses are basically a list of topics to be presented for debate at the university in Wittenberg. They specifically focus on the sale of indulgences. They may or may not have been dramatically nailed to the church door in Wittenberg, which is the common legend. We do know for a fact that they were mailed to Luther's bishop. If you're interested, this photo is actually a movie clip. That's Joseph Fiennes playing Martin Luther in a movie that came out maybe 15 years ago or so. And it's actually a really good movie about Luther, if you're interested in that. Luther mails this letter containing the 95 Theses to the Archbishop Albrecht of Mainz, basically giving the bishop a heads up that the debate will be taking place. But they were also printed thanks to the fairly recent invention of Gutenberg's printing press. And they were circulated widely. People who could read bought copies and read them. People who couldn't read gathered in public spaces to hear them read aloud. And what Luther thought was going to be simply an academic debate turned hotly political. People started getting excited about the fact that they may not have to send all their hard-earned money to Italy anymore. The church hierarchy suddenly realized that their income source was about to dry up, and things started to get a little bit wild. Luther began to preach on what would become his central doctrine, which is that people are made right with God by their faith alone through God's grace. No paying of money or any other act of penance, or really anything having to do with your personal behavior, could make God love you more or less. And that or less part has been a sticking point in Lutheran theology that's been debated both inside and outside the church ever since. The bishop is upset. The bishop writes to Rome. The Pope gets involved. Luther starts saying that the Pope is not infallible. In fact, maybe even the 95 Theses suggest that the Pope is not infallible, nor does he have the exclusive right to interpret Scripture. And in 1520, Luther is excommunicated from the church. In 1521 comes the event that all Lutheran middle schoolers love to talk about, the Diet of Worms, or of Worms in German. A diet is just a council meeting. Worms is the city in Germany where it happened, but we love to talk about the Diet of Worms anyway. Luther is brought before the Holy Roman Emperor and basically given one last chance. The Holy Roman Emperor at this point is Charles V. He is only 21 years old at this point in his life. He's a vassal of the Pope, and it's his day job to be King of Spain. But he also kind of has to come and keep things quiet in Germany. At the Diet of Worms, Luther is given one final opportunity to retract everything he has said and written since 1517. Little aside, Luther is famous for being a hot, under-the-collar writer who would lash out on almost any topic. But at the Diet of Worms, Luther responded with his famous words, "Here I stand, I can do no other." At this point, he's cast out of the church permanently, declared an outlaw, and his books are banned. At essence, at this point, he has rejected the supreme authority of the Pope. And that's about all I really need to say at this point about it, except that Luther had a protector, the Elector of Saxony, Frederick the Wise, who was sympathetic to Luther's cause. I think Frederick had a personal financial interest in keeping money from flowing to Italy himself. The common people did, and so did the lower level rulers. And so despite being declared a criminal, Luther managed to avoid being burned at the stake. He spent a year in hiding, during which he had time to translate the New Testament from Latin into German. And when the coast was clear-ish, he returned home. I think that's a good basic background. You will notice I haven't yet breathed a word about music, but we can really get into it at this point. Luther's initial beef with the church really had nothing to do with the liturgy or with music, but almost every new idea leads people down rabbit holes, and it soon became clear that there were ramifications of this whole idea of justification by grace through faith that would require some changes. Are there some questions or comments yet at this point? Having successfully put everyone to sleep. Oh, somebody's about to speak.
No, it's me.
Go ahead.
But I'm saying things because it's my job and I'm required to do so.
I would like you to.
You know, a couple of things that that I just think bear highlighting that Tim was just mentioning. I think as a theme for us to continue to think about throughout the course, the idea that awful people make beautiful things is a really great thing for us to sort of keep in mind, because that's something I continue to struggle with. It's certainly something that's hotly debated in popular culture now, in terms of like cancel culture. Like, can we still listen to Michael Jackson? Can we still listen to R. Kelly? That one's a pretty clear no, which really did horrible things for my karaoke slate of songs, because I was really good at Remix to Ignition. So this is just my own sadness. But I think the other thing that's really interesting that Tim was sort of bringing up is and we'll mention more, I'm sure, here as we talk a little bit more about this, is the way that technology influences the dissemination of information and the way that people's ideas are able to get out there. Like the timing of Luther's life with the printing press, I think, is incredibly significant. And one of the reasons why Luther was able to do so much to affect so many people. More on that soon. But I think about, like, our soon to be former President Trump and Twitter, and how what that presidency would have looked like without it. I think about things like genres like rap and the mixtape, or the 808 drum machine, and what that did for that genre. So I think there's like lots of ways that we could think about the way that technology influences what happens, whether it's available or it changes the way that we get information out and people are able to consume. So that's just another thing that I think we can keep in the back of our minds. So thanks. I'm done interrupting you now, Tim.
Excellent, Scott. I love that you noticed those things and chose to highlight them. So we're going to move on now to the Reformation of music, and just start with a little reflection again on the sound and perhaps the look of the medieval church. So if I'm remembering correctly, last week we already heard a mass by Josquin, who was, in fact, Luther mentions more than once, Josquin was Luther's favorite composer. And just as a little review of what that sounds like, we'll just hear a little bit of this mass, Missa Pange Lingua. So these choral masses were being sung in monasteries, in big city churches that were well funded, in churches associated with universities. The choirs were men only or men and boys. Women were expected to be silent. You probably learned already about the ordinary of the Mass. So these polyphonic masses sung by choirs had their Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, the Sanctus, the Agnus Dei. There were also significant portions of the Mass that were chanted, called the propers, which varied from one week to the next. You might use the same ordinary over and over again, but every week had assigned propers. Virtually the entire Mass was sung, including all the prayers and all the Bible readings. In rural areas, they didn't have time or money or education for polyphony. Everything was chanted by the priest. The priest may or may not have had any training. The priest may or may not have had any skill. In many places, the Mass was probably just sort of mumbled in kind of a monotone, notes going randomly up and down. I want to look also a little bit at church architecture. The architecture of the church was literally a barrier to participation by the people attending church. Churches were built as two separate rooms, separated by something called a rood screen, which you see here. The red line in the diagram shows how there's the larger part of the church, which is where the people would stand. There was nowhere to sit, just a big open space. And then in the top half beyond that red line is where the choir and the clergy would be. And there would be a physical barrier in between the two of them. Sometimes it was kind of a wooden lattice thing, like you see here. Sometimes it was literally a huge wall of stone with a door in it. Then this is a little interesting side thing. In the Counter-Reformation at the Council of Trent, the Catholic Church decided to get rid of rood screens, but the Protestants, who were sort of free to do whatever they wanted, often kept them. So you'll find Lutheran churches in Scandinavia and many, many churches and cathedrals in the British Isles still have their rood screens, but Catholic churches typically don't. But at the time, the Reformers considered this a barrier. So then, at that time, and as now, some people were probably more interested in what was going on than others. Some people might crowd around the screen to see and listen in. Other people might just sort of walk around the church and look at things, windows, the sculpture. All these churches have graves embedded in the floor. People might chat with their friends. They might come and go. It's very possible that all you could hear was a din with some music and chanting going off in the distance. But there were very important times when people needed to pay attention. Most important probably is the transubstantiation of the bread and the wine of the Eucharist into the body and blood of Christ, at which time you would want to look, you would want to kneel while the priest holds it up high. The common people would not have ever eaten the bread and wine, only the clergy did. But it was very important that you adore the body of Christ when you believe he is physically appearing in the room. So there were little hints to tell people that it was time to pay attention. One of them would have been these bells that some of you maybe have heard before. That's all there is to that video. Just gives you a hint of these Sanctus bells that let you know it's time to wake up and pay attention. Also the organ, which in the Middle Ages really was basically just a noisemaker and could be played at the time of the elevation of the host so that you would know that you should maybe stop your chatting and pay attention. And this is a fabulous recording, just wait. There's a good photo here of what that looks like. So you have the woman playing the organ and then a man pumping bellows. That piece was from an anonymous collection called the Buchsheimer Orgelbuch, which was published. It wasn't published. It came in manuscript from southern Germany about 1460. So what you heard were sort of long notes being played by the person's left hand, and then this decoration played by the right hand. And that kind of weird, creepy shaking sound is actually being done on purpose by the person who's pumping the air as kind of an ornament or a special effect. So maybe you noticed at the end, both the keys player and the bellows pumper were acknowledged. So how did things change for the early Lutherans? The early reformers had basically three options when it came to the liturgy. They could take it as it was, they could leave it completely behind, or they could amend it or changed it. Luther was quite close to the first option, although there were some emendations that were made. Luther's initial reforms were very conservative. They were even more conservative than the Anglicans. Although, interestingly, it's the Anglicans or the Episcopalians now who are sometimes called Catholic light. But Luther didn't make a lot of changes to the liturgy. When we say he was a conservative reformer, we don't mean that in the same way that we think about conservatism in the United States today. What the word conservative means in this case is basically he chose not to make any changes unless he thought that a certain practice was in direct opposition to his theology. Once the Reformation got going, there were all kinds of people who had all kinds of different ideas about what should happen next, even among Luther's colleagues in Wittenberg. And that's the reason we have like dozens of different types of Protestant today. People haven't really agreed on what the implications of this theology should be since the very beginning. But Luther was one who tended to keep stuff. This is from his first writing on the liturgy in 1523. So now we're 6 years after the 95 Theses and 2 years after the Diet of Worms. He says, "It is not now, nor ever has been, our intention to abolish the liturgical service of God completely, but rather to purify the one that is now in use from the wretched accretions which corrupt it and point out an evangelical use." We should also point out that evangelical didn't mean the same thing then that it does in contemporary America. Evangelical, its Greek root word just means good news, and it was actually the term that Luther himself preferred for his new movement once it got going. And if any of you speak German, the Lutheran church in Germany is called the Evangelische Kirche, the evangelical church, but it's nothing like American evangelicalism. Luther had two worship issues he was really concerned about. One was that he wanted to remove all language about sacrifice, which implied that the priest and the people were performing a good work to curry favor with God. They believed that the one final perfect sacrifice was performed once for all by Jesus himself. And Luther taught that what happened in the Mass was a gift from God to the people, not a reenactment of Christ's passion. So any liturgical ceremony and prayers around the offertory were eliminated, and the entire medieval prayer of thanksgiving was eliminated. The part where people believe the bread and wine actually physically become the body and blood of Christ. So all that remained after the Sanctus were the words of institution from the Bible. On the night in which he was betrayed, our Lord Jesus took bread, etc. Lutherans to this day debate about whether only those words should be said at that time, or if you can have a prayer of thanksgiving that just doesn't have sacrifice language in it. I think Luther would sort of enjoy that debate and probably would choose a side, but I honestly can't tell you which side he would choose. But Luther chose sides on everything. Related more closely to our topic today, and as we were discussing at the very beginning when we listened to Martin Luther King, Luther wanted people to have more to do in the liturgy than just watch. He wanted them to be able to hear and understand and to add their own voices. He also wanted them to learn scripture and the catechism. We've talked about how music is an aid to memory. You set something you can't remember to a tune, and it comes right back to you. So Luther encouraged the development of congregational hymn singing in German. And he urged people to come to communion at every Mass. This is another quote. I also wish that we had as many songs as possible in the vernacular, meaning German in this case, which the people could sing during Mass, immediately after the gradual and also after the Sanctus and Agnus Dei. For who doubts that originally, prior to the medieval period, all the people sang these, which now only the choir sings. I think one of the reasons that Luther made few changes and slow changes to the liturgy was that he was himself a fine musician and really appreciated the gifts of the choir to the Latin Mass. Josquin was, as I said, was his favorite composer, and he wasn't about to throw out polyphonic choral music. To this day, Lutherans are usually noted for a good balance of strong congregational singing and a lively choral tradition, which I think not every denomination can claim in quite the same way. Hymns in German were not actually a brand new thing. People had been singing hymns at outdoor festivals, in processions. There was even a vernacular preaching service called Prone that was sometimes stuck into the middle of a Mass before the Reformation. It's very likely that different things happened in different places, but German hymns weren't completely unheard of. And one example of a hymn that was already being sung in German prior to the Reformation is this one. I'm actually showing them to you in English and in modern notation, both to show you that this is still a living tradition and to, just as Luther did, I think the use of the vernacular is really key to understanding. So all the hymns I'm going to show you today are actually straight out of our Lutheran hymnal that we use to this day. Modern notation in English. The first verse of this one is of medieval origin, and then Luther wrote the rest of the verses. This hymn is in a style called a Leise, because the final words at the very end of each verse, Lord have mercy, were originally Kyrie eleis, is how you would pronounce that in German. So any song that ends Kyrie eleis is a Leise. This is one of the hymns that Luther specifically recommended as one that should be, that would be a good example for what people should sing. I'm going to actually sing this for you. If you'd like to sing along, feel free. Now to the Holy Spirit let us pray, for true faith most needed on our way. Guide us and defend us when life is ending, and our journey homeward is tending. Lord, have mercy. That's enough of my singing, although you'll get more in a minute. More songs were needed. They didn't have many. And in 1524, Luther started asking his friends to write German hymns, including settings of the Psalms. And he actually made an example, which he mailed to people so they could see what he was suggesting. And this is one of them. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord, hear me calling. I can't sing the whole thing right now because the little screen with your pictures is right in front of it. So, but you don't need to hear the whole thing. Just to know that this is a hymn by Luther, and by doing one himself, he was able to encourage others to do the same thing. The organ was not used for accompaniment at this time. You heard what the organ sounded like and how it may or may not have done very well to accompany people singing. So at this stage, very early on, the hymns were sung without accompaniment and in unison, just the single melody line like chant. This is a term Scott probably wants you to know, and it will come back when you talk about Bach. These Lutheran hymns are called chorales, and the definition is just a German Protestant hymn melody intended for singing by a congregation, such as those that were written in the 16th to 18th centuries. Nowadays, sometimes choirs are called chorales, including the Santa Clara Chorale. Sometimes we think chorales have four-part harmony, and that's what makes them chorales. But these unison hymn tunes are chorales. And whenever I say the word chorale, this is what I'm talking about. Luther was also somewhat insistent that this new music not just put new German words with the existing chants, not just translate. Language itself is musical, and in the same way that various peoples have their own languages, each language, Luther thought, was best presented, or we sometimes agree, each language is best presented with a certain musical character. Luther wanted his music to sound German. So now, where do the melodies for these hymns come from? They often did, in fact, just come from Gregorian chant. So right here are two hymns that are, in fact, side by side in our hymnal today. It's the same hymn. First, with its original Gregorian chant. Creator Spirit, heavenly dove, descend upon us from above. With graces manifold restore your creatures as they were before. Or, in its German tune, Creator Spirit, heavenly dove, descend upon us from above. Da 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 da. Once again, it's behind the pictures of you all, so I couldn't sing it. But you see how it really is the chant melody, but it's given this sort of more vigorous sound, which seemed more German. Sometimes when I'm teaching these hymns to people, I say, imagine yourself with a big mug of beer in your hand, and you're kind of swinging your beer mug while you sing it. Sometimes the tunes came from folk tunes. They might have been actual pre-existing tunes, or they might have been newly composed tunes using the conventions of folk tunes. Music is one of the 7 liberal arts, and at that time, any educated man could write music by following the standard conventions for tune writing. I don't know if you'll ever talk about the guilds of Meistersingers, but the Meistersingers were people they were amateur poets and musicians who would participate in contests, who would see who could produce the best song. But the best song wasn't the most creative song or the most interesting song. It was the song that kind of most accurately followed the very strict rules they had in place for writing songs. So at least one person I know has commented that all these German chorales kind of sound the same, because they all follow these conventional tunes for hymn writing. Let's see, what do I have next? Not that one yet. You might sometimes hear that Lutherans adapted music sung in taverns for the hymn tunes. And this is only kind of partially true. People who today advocate for using popular music in church love to capitalize on this. Luther got his music at the bar. But I think it's important to remember that in the 16th century, there was no recording industry. There was no commercially driven music production. Singing was a very natural, everyday part of life, and one thing that people did for entertainment in bars, when there weren't big screen TVs or jukeboxes, was to sing folk songs or even polyphonic madrigals. But there weren't big distinctions between different styles of music. A madrigal and a liturgical motet sounded a lot alike. The melodies of folk songs and hymns were really not that different. Luther is sometimes quoted as having said, "Why should the devil have all the good tunes?" There's no evidence that he actually said this. Some people have attributed the same quote to Saint Gregory. Some people say it was the founder of the Salvation Army. One reason that people sometimes say these tunes came from bars is that bar form is the name for a particular pattern of phrases within a tune. And it was a pattern used by the Meister singers and very common in the chorales. Bar form means you have a phrase, the same music repeats a second time. So it's A, and then you have a B phrase that's different. And any tune that has that repeated initial phrase is a bar tune. So in this one, da 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 da. Next phrase. Da 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 da. The rest of the song. Da 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 da. Once you know about bar form, you see it everywhere. The Star Spangled Banner is in bar form. Da 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 bum bum ba da 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 dun dun da 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 da. Then da 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 da. It repeats that whole first part, and then it has the rest of the song. Bar form is everywhere. Bar form wasn't necessarily invented in bars, it was just the form of the tune. It is sometimes said that Luther threw out the Latin Mass. He absolutely did not. In fact, his point was only that people should be able to understand what was happening in church. In places where Latin was understood, Latin continued to be used. Latin was the language of universities. It was the language of commerce. Knowledge of Latin was a very important part of everyone's education, and Luther encouraged the continued use of Latin to aid children in their learning. City churches and university churches in Lutheran areas continued to worship in Latin long after the Reformation. Even at the time of Bach, which you're going to learn about next week, the worship in the main churches in Leipzig was bilingual. Portions were in German, portions were in Latin. There was lots of continued development in worship in German. The literacy rate at this time and place was actually only about 5%. So even though Luther thought Latin was important, he knew it wasn't realistic. And then, as I also said earlier, I think not every place had a choir. So German hymns were written that could take the place of the ordinary of the Mass. And that's these next little examples. These are paraphrases of the ordinary. They're not direct translations of the Latin text. And they often include sort of additional commentary to help people learn the faith. So these three examples are derived from chant, as some of the other ones we saw, but they are in fact portions of the ordinary. So the first one is the Kyrie. This one actually existed, I think, before the Reformation. All glory be to God on high. In German is Allein Gott in der Höhe sei or it's glory to God in the highest. And this one is the Credo. We all believe in one true God. I'm actually going to sing. I'm going to have to look in my hymnal so I can see around it. And I'm going to sing this one for you because I want you to see how it might be perceived today as being on the challenging side. We all believe in one true God, who created earth and heaven, the Father who to us in love has the right of children given. He in soul and body feeds us, all we need his hand provides us, through all snares and perils leads us, watching that no harm betide us. He cares for us day and night. All things are governed by his might. It's not really catchy to us today. And many people in my Lutheran congregation would say That's way too hard. Don't make us sing that. They would have been easier for 16th century Germans. And why is that? I'll tell you as soon as I take a drink of water. The chant melodies and the folk song conventions that we've already talked about would have been very familiar to people. Number one. Number two, there just weren't that many hymns. The very first Lutheran hymnal was just a pamphlet with only 8 hymns in it. It was called Etliche Christliche Lieder, published in 1524, so we're just barely starting to establish a collection of hymns. Etliche Christliche Lieder was commonly nicknamed the Acht Liederbuch, and Acht Liederbuch literally means the book of 8 songs. So if you only have 8 songs and you sing the same thing every week, you learn pretty quickly. And remember that most people still couldn't read. There were not hymnals provided at the church. So if you could read and you wanted a copy of the hymnal, you bought it yourself. Otherwise, you learned the hymns by ear and by constant repetition. Third, the hymns were used liturgically and not as standalone pieces. So yet again, you're using the same one for weeks in a row, if not years at a time. In addition to the hymns that functioned as part of the ordinary of the Mass, by the end of the 16th century, Lutherans had introduced something called the De Tempore hymn, or the hymn of the day, sung either before or after the sermon. There were lists developed, so basically people in a whole given region would sing the same songs as every other church was singing on the same Sunday year after year. So Lutherans developed this core of hymns that were just very familiar and constantly used. Among all the churches that still use a liturgy to this day, this feature of the service, the hymn after the sermon, is unique to Lutherans. I think these melodies are actually a lot of fun. You imagine yourself with a stein of beer, maybe at the Renaissance Festival, and if you sing them a lot, you'd actually come to enjoy them quite a lot. I think I'm going to just skip this one. This is one other example. Except with this one, notice that it has about a zillion verses. So what the Lutherans started doing very early on was, instead of just having the people sit and sing all of the zillion verses in a row, they developed a practice called alternatim, or the alternating practice. So one group of people might sing a verse of the hymn. Maybe the second verse would be sung by the choir. Maybe the third verse would be sung by another group of people. So you'd sort of split it up to make it more interesting. The number of hymns grew really quickly. Already by 1524, we have the first Lutheran choir book. This was a friend of Luther's in Wittenberg, Johann Walter, who wrote a bunch of motets based on the Lutheran hymns. So they could do this alternatim praxis. Congregation sings some stuff, choir sings some stuff. I'll play one of these based on this hymn. The melody is still in the tenor, just like the masses that Scott showed us last week. So it might be hard to pick out if you don't know the hymn. And then I'll also say these pieces by Walter and others could be, all the parts could be sung, or they could be played by string instruments or wind instruments. There was almost infinite variations in how this stuff could be used. So this is Nun bitten wir den Heiligen Geist, or Now to the Spirit Let Us Pray, by Walter. I'm going to play for you one final example. We're going to bridge between Walter and Bach, jumping ahead 95 years to 1619. This whole idea of the alternatum practice hits its high point in the 17th century. And this is an example of what can happen if you have a whole lot of instrumentalists and more than one choir at your disposal. 4, in the case of the example I'm going to show you, located in various positions around the church, perhaps a large and fairly literate congregation. By this time, the melody has moved to the soprano, so you'll be able to hear that clearly. The alternatum happens not just between the verses of the hymn, but even between individual lines of text. I don't know why I can't go to the next slide. What we're going to hear is a Christmas tune, In Dulce Jubilo, which you may know in English as Good Christian Friends Rejoice. The words in the original actually alternate between Latin and German, phrase by phrase. The music by Michael Pretorius. If you have great speakers or headphones, crank them up. This will knock your socks off. I have sometimes said that this piece, particularly after the trumpet fanfare that happens about halfway through, is the kind of thing that convinces me of the existence of God. So this is Michael Pretorius, In Dulce Jubilo. Now I'm ready for it. Isn't that fun? That's actually my very favorite Christmas album. It's called The Mass for Christmas Morning, and it literally, I mean, it's like an hour and a half long, but all the chants and propers of the Mass with hymns, with the sung readings, and that In Dulce Jubilo is the last thing. I think we're about ready to stop there. I just want to point out some really good reading material if you're interested in more on this. One is a book by my mentor, Paul Westermeyer, who wrote this volume, Te Deum, The Church in Music, Church and Music, which basically is the entire history of music in the church from the beginning until now. The copy I have is actually his draft copy that I read in a class in seminary right before it was published. You can see what Martin Luther himself had to say about music in volume 53 of Luther's works. Any decent library has all of them. I think there are 54, and Liturgy and Hymns is volume 53. And then Evangelical Lutheran Worship is just the name of our denominational hymnal, which has many of these songs, but also just paging through it sort of helps you see what has happened with Lutheran congregational singing through the centuries since that time. So I think I'll stop at this point and ask for questions or discussion or whatever.
So a couple of things just to show you. I wrote down so many connections between what Tim was talking about and the things that we've either already spoken about or will speak about. So this was perfect in terms of connecting a lot of the material we've been talking about. I want to show you a couple of things. First of all, this. I think this just really summarizes what a cantus firmus is in lots of ways. Remember, the cantus firmus is the fixed melody of a Renaissance polyphonic song, basically, or composition, which is usually derived from chant, and tends to be the boring long note tune that a bunch of people are doing florid embellishment around. We heard that in the Josquin example that Tim played for us today. We heard it in our examples that we listened to last week. And what's kind of cool is that the chorale kind of becomes the new cantus firmus in the Lutheran Church in particular. And that's what we're going to really see in Bach, is the idea that we use the hymn as sort of the launching off point for polyphony. And we were seeing that in the example of the Pretorius that Tim was showing us. The hymn tune is what all of that was derived out of, but it's I made this crazy arrangement out of it and I threw a whole bunch of stuff on top of it. So I just saw this on Facebook the other day and had to share it with you all. So little cantus firmus meme. The other thing is, Tim mentioned the Sanctus bells. Keep those in mind for later when we start getting masses with the orchestra, because those things are going to come back hot and heavy. Every time we get a Sanctus movement, you're going to be why is that so clanging and bangy? And that's because the Sanctus bells and why big loud things happen in that movement. Also, Tim mentioned that Luther would write angry emails. Or not emails. Oh my God, what is wrong with me? Would write angry things to people. Well, there's a whole Luther insult generator that you can find on the internet, which quotes Luther's writings. And so this one, "You roar as one possessed and full of devils." I could take it. Insult me again, Luther. "Even if your writings were from an angel from heaven, I would take this horrible document and, after having used it as toilet paper, wipe its nose." Oh, that's rough. That is rough. Okay, one more. What else you got to say? You stick mounds. So good. So I just love that Luther was also kind of a jerk in lots of ways. Also, you saw in the John Green video that we watched that he wasn't always on the right side of history necessarily. He was certainly he's this person that we often think of as for the people and for independence of thought, and our own ability to interpret the scripture. But he also supported, the consolidation of power in the monarchy, against the will of the people. So he's complicated. He certainly was not a huge fan of Jews. And so there's a lot of complicated history in terms of anti-Semitism in the Lutheran Church, and in a lot of composers who wrote Lutheran music. So that's not to sweep all of those things under the rug, but there's some complicated things about Luther. Lots of amazing things that Luther did, but also many, many complicated and not so amazing things. Um,
That's a really good point, and gets back again to what do you do with when you have wonderful stuff that came out of very flawed human beings?
totally. Um, the the other thing that this makes me think of is that just in terms of connecting Martin Luther King, and also like, some of the events of the last couple of weeks in our country, I think sometimes we see Christianity as a force that has done a lot of bad or is used for purposes that seem very anti-Christian in a lot of ways. Like a Jesus saves sign while storming the Capitol of the United States is something that I've seen in images in recent history here. But I think one thing that's really important to remember is that a lot of very powerful movements for good and for positive change in our world have also had very strong connections with the Christian church. We can think about the Black Southern Church and how so much of the civil rights movement came out of literally the church, of pastors and meetings at churches, and how inextricable music was linked to those movements. So I think that's something to sort of hold in balance, that like, the consolidation of the repertoire of the Gregorian chant was done in part because we wanted to indoctrinate people into the Christian faith to consolidate power in the empire. But like also there are other things that come out of these traditions as well. So I think we should remember to hold those things in balance. Another thing, that organ example you played, Tim, there was someone operating the bellows and somebody playing the keyboard. And this just blows my mind because like in the early church, if you had a church organ, you needed like your bellow boys to like show up and like pump that thing so that you could practice. I mean, like that's super inconvenient. I don't understand how anybody would have ever practiced the organ.
Well, and
Back
not
in the
even
day.
just early church, but really until electricity became a thing, like all the way until the beginning of the 20th century. Pipe organs had to be pumped by humans to have enough air in them. And the one that we saw was actually just a little baby organ. You could see it was a tiny little keyboard, and the bellows were right there. By the time, I don't know if you'll end up talking about Bach organ music at all next week, but during the 17th and the 18th century, organs as instruments became these huge things that would require multiple people to pump them. You'd have to have 3 or 4 friends that you were willing to pay in order to practice the organ.
I mean, like, I don't understand how the organ exists still. Like, there were so many impediments to it being a useful tool. Like, in what world does it make sense? Like, I have this instrument, but I could only practice it if I could get like 14 people to like push these bellows up and down a bunch. Like, how is that a practical thing?
I think it
But I
really
get,
impressed people at the time, like
well,
especially once you hit the 17th century. The organ was magnificent. It was the loudest sound that could be made by a human. Was that? I mean, it was before the Industrial Revolution, so there were no factories, there were no train locomotives. The organ was really, I think it inspired people as an object of power. Um, which so then in church that sort of led their thoughts to God, because
mhm.
sort of here's this all-powerful sound that we can make in praise of the all-powerful one.
Well, and Tim
But
talked
then
about, oh, sorry, go ahead. You
I
finish.
was just going to say, and then also the other end of the extreme, like the organ can be the loudest sound known to humankind, or it can play very soft, sweet, intimate things. So I think its variation has always fascinated people.
Totally. And I mean, I think like you make a really great point that you alluded to earlier with like all of the art and architecture that was happening in the medieval, like the like Renaissance era in the church. A lot of, if you think about an illiterate population coming to church, all of this iconography and art and splendor of like big loud things is meant to like impress you with the power of God and make you feel like humble in the presence of God. Like if this is what God can do on earth, like can you just imagine what it's like in heaven? Like that kind of idea. So when you think about these, like, especially this polychoral splendor, which is a lot of our listening this coming week, by the way, everybody, the like kind of like Pretorius example that Tim played for us at the end. If you have music coming from like different places in the church, different balconies and multiple organs, it's like early surround sound. This is like, you know, going to the IMAX and having like this immersive or like VR, you know, of the day. Like, this is really the cutting edge technology. You know, we don't have surround sound speakers. We just like literally surround you with sound. So it's cool and interesting how people use the space and all of these things to like show the power and authority of God. If you watched the wind ensemble and orchestra concert last Friday, there was a Gabrielli piece that the brass ensemble played. Catherine, I think you played in that, right? And you could see why brass players love this kind of music, because there's just so many different parts and so many different little moving things and these big, huge chords. So it's cool to imagine what these pieces sounded like. Let's see, what else? I wrote like 14 other things. Okay, so Tim, I have a couple of questions for you. So like, what about all these instruments in the early church? Like, I thought instruments were kind of like the devil, and we don't really want them in there. But then, like, we've got all these Lutheran musicians, especially coming out of Germany, and like the polychoral tradition that sort of is coming out with like Schütz and Schein and these kind of composers, where we start to just throw all kinds of instruments into the church. Like, you know, do you have any like further comments on that or anything? Because they're going to be listening to a bunch of stuff like that this week.
It's a key difference between Luther and his immediate circle and some of the other Protestants. So we didn't even get into like John Calvin or Ulrich Zwingli or some of these other reformers who really, and this was in the reading you sent me, Scott, I think, about this sort of discomfort with music overall. And there were definitely strains within the Reformation who thought that music was sort of carnal or bad or sort of impure somehow. So many of these other Protestant traditions were vocal only, absolutely not instruments, not even the organ. And I think Luther and his friends were musicians and they loved music, and they actually felt that it could impart God to people, that it didn't have to be so carnal and bad for you, but maybe this is how we connect to God.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's a great place to leave it. Can we thank Tim one more time? I know we're at 1 minute past here. So thank you all for sticking with us. And if you have other questions, feel free to write me an email, and I might send out an announcement with a couple of other hints this week. Okay. Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Tim.
Thanks to you all. It was great.
Thank you.